My name is William and I'm 28 years old. What I'm about to tell you, God, I don't even know where to begin. My hands are shaking as I type this, and every shadow in my peripheral vision makes me flinch. But I need to get this story out there, to warn others, to make sense of the horror I've experienced. Maybe, just maybe, someone out there will believe me. It all started 3 weeks ago. I had just moved to a small town on the edge of the Pine Barrens in New Jersey for a new job as a wildlife biologist. The forest had always fascinated me, with its unique ecosystem and the legends that surrounded it. Little did I know that those legends would soon become my living nightmare. My first few days in town were uneventful. I settled into my small cabin on the outskirts of the forest, eager to begin my research. The locals were friendly enough, but there was always an undercurrent of unease when I mentioned my plans to explore deep into the Barrens. They'd share knowing looks, change the subject, or mutter something about staying on the marked trails. I brushed it off as small-town superstition. On the night of the full moon, I decided to do a night survey of nocturnal animals. I packed my gear, camera traps, night vision goggles, and a high-powered flashlight, and set off into the woods just as the sun was setting. The forest was alive with the usual nighttime sounds: owls hooting, crickets chirping, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But as I ventured deeper, those familiar sounds began to fade, replaced by an eerie silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had been walking for about an hour when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. That sound, it wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a coyote, not any animal I could identify. And it was close. Slowly I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling. As I flicked it on, the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense foliage around me. And there, just at the edge of the light, I saw a pair of eyes reflecting back at me. They were huge, glowing an unnatural amber color, and filled with an intelligence that sent ice through my veins. I took a step back, and that's when it moved. In a blur of motion almost too fast to follow, a massive shape burst from the undergrowth. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was like a wolf, but the size of a bear, standing on its hind legs. Its fur was matted and dark, its muzzle pulled back in a snarl that revealed rows of gleaming teeth. I ran. Oh God, I ran like I've never run before. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me at every step, but pure adrenaline kept me going. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the forest, that terrible growl now a full-throated roar that seemed to shake the very air around me. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, my lungs burning, my legs screaming for rest. But I didn't dare stop, not with that thing behind me. Somehow, miraculously, I broke through the tree line, stumbling onto the road near my cabin. I risked a glance back, and for a split second, I saw it at the edge of the forest. It stood there, massive and terrifying, those amber eyes locked onto me. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it melted back into the shadows. I made it back to my cabin, locking every door and window, huddling in the corner with a kitchen knife clutched in my shaking hands. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes, heard that bone-chilling growl. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had been a hallucination, a trick of the moonlight and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew what I had seen, and worse, I had a feeling it wasn't over. My suspicions were confirmed a week later when I overheard a conversation at the local diner. Two old-timers were talking in hushed tones about livestock being killed, something stalking the edges of town at night. They mentioned an old legend, something about a curse that had plagued the Pine Barrens for generations. Driven by a mix of scientific curiosity and a desperate need to understand what was happening, I began to dig. I spent days in the local library, poring over old newspapers, town records, and books on local folklore. What I found chilled me to the bone. The legend dated back to the early 1700s when the first European settlers came to the area. They spoke of a Native American shaman who had placed a curse on the land and its people, angered by their encroachment on sacred grounds. The curse, they said, would turn men into beasts slaves to the full moon and their own savage instincts. At first, I wanted to dismiss it as just another folktale, but the more I researched, the more the pieces started to fit together. Every few decades, there would be a rash of mysterious animal attacks, sightings of a creature that couldn't be explained. And always, they coincided with the lunar cycle. As I delved deeper into the mystery, strange things began to happen. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of scratching at my door. Sometimes in the distance, I'd hear that same bone-chilling howl that had haunted my dreams since that night in the forest. And once, just once, I caught a glimpse of something large and dark moving at the edge of my property, gone before I could get a clear look. The locals began to avoid me. When I'd try to ask questions about the legend or the recent attacks, they'd clam up, making excuses to leave. Some looked at me with pity, others with suspicion. I was an outsider, poking my nose where it didn't belong, but I couldn't stop. I was in too deep, driven by a need to understand, to find some rational explanation for what I'd experienced. And then, 2 nights ago, everything changed. I was up late, going over my notes, trying to find a pattern in the historical attacks. The full moon hung heavy in the sky, casting long shadows across my cabin. I had just about convinced myself that I was chasing fairy tales when I heard it, that low rumbling growl right outside my window. My blood ran cold. Slowly I turned to look, and there it was. The creature, the werewolf. It was even larger than I remembered, its massive form silhouetted against the moonlight. Those amber eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I saw something that shook me to my core. Recognition, intelligence. This wasn't just some animal. There was something terribly, horrifyingly human in those eyes. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. Then with deliberate slowness, it raised a clawed hand and dragged it down the window, leaving deep gouges in the glass. The message was clear. No barrier could keep it out. No place was safe. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bathroom, the only room without windows, a loaded shotgun across my lap. When dawn finally broke, I emerged, half expecting to find my cabin in ruins. But everything was as I'd left it, save for those deep claw marks on the window, proof that I hadn't imagined it all. That was yesterday. I've spent the last 24 hours in a frenzy, boarding up windows, setting up motion-activated lights around the property. But deep down, I know it's futile. Whatever this thing is, whatever curse or evil has taken root in these woods, it's not going to be stopped by a few pieces of plywood and some bright lights. I'm writing this now as a record, a warning to anyone who might stumble upon these words. There's something out there in the Pine Barrens, something that defies explanation. It's watching, waiting, and I fear it's only a matter of time before it decides to do more than just frighten me. To anyone reading this, stay away from the Pine Barrens. Don't dismiss the old legends and local superstitions. There's truth in them, a dark and terrifying truth that I've learned firsthand. As for me, I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to run, to get as far away from this cursed place as possible, but another part, the scientist in me perhaps, or maybe just the fool, wants to stay, to understand, to find a way to end this. The sun is setting now, and with it comes a dread that settles deep in my bones. I can feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness beyond my windows. The night is coming, and with it, I fear, comes the beast. If anyone finds this, please tell my story. Let people know what's out there, and pray. Pray that somehow I find a way to survive what's coming. This is William, signing off. God help me. The days that followed my terrifying encounter were a blur of paranoia and frantic research. I barely slept, surviving on coffee and adrenaline, my eyes constantly darting to the windows, expecting to see those amber eyes staring back at me. I knew I should leave, knew that staying was madness, but something kept me rooted to this place, a need for answers, perhaps, or a foolish belief that I could somehow solve this mystery. I threw myself into my research with renewed vigor. The local library became my second home, and I pored over every scrap of information I could find about the area's history and folklore. The more I dug, the more complex the story became. The curse, it seemed, was more than just a simple transformation of man into beast. It was a tangled web of tragedy and revenge that stretched back centuries. I uncovered tales of early settlers who had desecrated sacred Native American burial grounds, of a shaman whose entire tribe had been wiped out by smallpox brought by the newcomers. In his grief and rage, he had called upon dark forces, binding his spirit to the land and vowing that the descendants of those who had wronged him would forever be cursed to become the very beasts they feared. But there was more to it than that. The curse didn't affect everyone. It seemed to choose its victims, passing sometimes from parent to child, other times striking seemingly at random. And those afflicted didn't just transform physically. Their minds were twisted too, filled with an insatiable hunger and a burning hatred for humanity. As I delved deeper into these grim tales, I began to notice changes in myself. My senses seemed heightened. Smells were more intense, sounds clearer. At first I attributed it to my constant state of alertness, but as the days wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. One week after my encounter in the woods, I woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. My skin felt too tight, my bones aching as if I'd run a marathon. And the sounds, dear God, the sounds. I could hear everything. The scurrying of a mouse in the walls, the flutter of an owl's wings 100 yards away, the steady thump of a deer's heart deep in the forest. Panic gripped me as a terrible realization began to dawn. The curse, had it somehow affected me? Was I becoming one of them? I scrambled to the bathroom, flicking on the light and staring at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes, had they always had that yellowish tinge? And were my teeth always this sharp? A wave of nausea washed over me, and I gripped the sink, trying to steady myself. This couldn't be happening. It had to be my imagination, the stress and lack of sleep playing tricks on my mind. But even as I tried to rationalize it, deep down, I knew. Something had changed that night in the forest. The creature hadn't just chased me, it had marked me. The next few days were a waking nightmare. I oscillated between denial and terror, watching myself for any sign of further changes. My appetite increased dramatically, and I found myself craving meat. The rarer, the better. My temper usually even became volatile. Small frustrations would send me into a rage, and more than once I caught myself growling, actually growling, in anger. I knew I should leave, should seek help, but who would believe me? And more importantly, what if I was right? What if I was changing? I couldn't risk hurting anyone. So I stayed, isolating myself in my cabin, trying desperately to find a solution in the dusty old books and faded newspaper clippings I'd collected. It was during one of these frantic research sessions that I came across a name that would change everything: Elizabeth Blackwood. She was mentioned in a small article from 1943, described as a local eccentric who claimed to have found a cure for the forest sickness. The article dismissed her as a crackpot, but something about it caught my attention. The description of the forest sickness, increased aggression, heightened senses, an aversion to silver, it all fit. With trembling hands, I began to search for more information about Elizabeth Blackwood. It wasn't easy. Most records from that time were spotty at best, but eventually I managed to piece together her story. Elizabeth had been a botanist, specializing in the unique flora of the Pine Barrens. In the early 1940s, her husband had been afflicted by the curse. Rather than flee or give in to despair, Elizabeth had devoted herself to finding a cure. She spent years experimenting with various plants and herbs native to the area, believing that if the curse was tied to the land, the cure must be as well. The more I read about Elizabeth's work, the more hope began to bloom in my chest. Here at last was someone who had approached the problem scientifically. Someone who hadn't dismissed the curse as mere superstition, but had instead sought to understand and counter it. But my hope was tempered by a grim reality. Elizabeth had disappeared in 1947, leaving behind only a cryptic journal filled with half-finished formulas and rambling notes about moonlight and blood rituals. The journal was now part of the local historical society's collection, kept under lock and key. I knew what I had to do. That journal was my only hope, the only chance I had of understanding what was happening to me and how to stop it. but getting access to it wouldn't be easy. The Historical Society was small and suspicious of outsiders, especially those asking questions about local legends. As I formulated a plan to get my hands on Elizabeth's journal, I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The changes in my body were accelerating. My nails had grown thicker, more claw-like, and clumps of coarse hair had begun to sprout on the backs of my hands. Worse, my mind felt clouded. Primal urges bubbled just beneath the surface of my consciousness, and it was becoming harder and harder to control them. The full moon was just days away, and with it, I feared, would come my first complete transformation. The thought filled me with a terror so profound it was almost paralyzing. But I couldn't give in to fear. I had to act, had to find that journal and unlock its secrets before it was too late. As night fell, I steeled myself for what was to come. I would go into town tomorrow, charm or coerce my way into the Historical Society's archives and find Elizabeth's journal. And if that didn't work, well, the beast that I was becoming wouldn't be stopped by locked doors or alarm systems. One way or another, I would have answers. I just prayed that those answers would come before the monster inside me took full control. The next morning, I woke with a sense of grim determination. The changes in my body were now impossible to ignore. My muscles felt denser, more powerful, and when I looked in the mirror, I could swear my facial structure had subtly shifted, becoming more elongated, more wolf-like. I dressed carefully, choosing loose-fitting clothes to hide the changes in my physique, and a pair of gloves to conceal my claw-like nails. As I prepared to leave, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. For a moment, I hardly recognized the wild-eyed, haggard man staring back at me. Was this really what I had become in just a few short weeks? Shaking off these dark thoughts, I got into my car and drove into town. The Pine Barrens Historical Society was housed in an old Victorian building on the main street, its paint peeling and windows grimy. As I approached, I could feel my heightened senses kicking in. I could smell the musty odor of old books and the faint scent of the elderly woman who sat behind the reception desk. "Can I help you?" she asked as I entered, her voice quavering slightly. Could she sense something off about me? Did she know what I was becoming? I forced a smile, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Yes, I'm a researcher from the university," I lied smoothly. "I'm doing a study on local flora, and I was hoping to access some of your archives. Particularly, I'm interested in the work of Elizabeth Blackwood." At the mention of Elizabeth's name, the old woman's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "Elizabeth Blackwood?" she repeated, her voice careful. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. What exactly is your interest in her work?" I could feel my patience wearing thin, a growl building in my throat that I had to forcibly suppress. "It's purely academic," I managed to say, my voice strained. "Her notes on the local plant life could be invaluable to my research." The woman studied me for a long moment, and I had the unsettling feeling that she could see right through my facade. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Very well," she said. "The archives are in the basement. I'll show you down." As we descended the creaky stairs to the basement, the musty smell grew stronger, mixed with something else, something old and organic that made my newly sensitive nose twitch. The basement was a maze of shelves and filing cabinets, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. "Elizabeth's materials are over here," the woman said, leading me to a locked cabinet in the corner. She unlocked it with a key from a large ring at her waist, then fixed me with a stern look. "These documents are very old and fragile. Please be careful with them." I nodded, barely able to contain my eagerness, as she pulled out a battered leather journal and several folders filled with loose papers. As soon as she placed them on a nearby table, I could smell it, a faint, spicy scent that seemed to call to something deep inside me. "I'll leave you to your work," the woman said. "Just ring the bell when you're finished." With that, she turned and climbed back up the stairs, leaving me alone with Elizabeth Blackwood's legacy. With trembling hands, I opened the journal. The pages were yellowed with age, covered in a spidery handwriting that seemed to dance before my eyes. As I began to read, I felt a chill run down my spine. Elizabeth hadn't just been studying the curse, she had been living it. Her husband, John, had been bitten during a hunting trip in 1939. Elizabeth had watched in horror as he transformed for the first time, his body twisting and contorting into a monstrous, wolf-like form. But rather than flee, she had dedicated herself to finding a cure. The journal detailed years of research and experimentation. Elizabeth had scoured the Pine Barrens, collecting plants and studying the old legends. She spoke of moonlight rituals and blood magic, of herbs that could calm the beast and others that seemed to accelerate the transformation. As I delved deeper into her notes, a pattern began to emerge. Elizabeth believed that the curse was tied to a specific species of plant that grew only in the deepest, most isolated parts of the Pine Barrens. This plant, which she called Lupin's Bane, supposedly had the power to both trigger and potentially cure the lycanthropic transformation. My heart raced as I read her description of the plant, a small, unassuming herb with silvery leaves and deep purple flowers that bloomed only under the full moon. Elizabeth had theorized that a tincture made from the plant's roots, combined with other ingredients in a complex ritual, could reverse the curse, but her notes became increasingly frantic towards the end. She wrote of being watched, of howls in the night that seemed to be calling to her. The final entry, dated just days before her disappearance, was particularly chilling. The moon is nearly full, and I can feel John slipping away. The beast is taking over, and I fear this may be our last chance. Tomorrow night, we'll venture into the heart of the Barrens to perform the ritual. If it fails, God help us all. That was the last anyone had ever heard from Elizabeth Blackwood. Had she succeeded in her desperate attempt to cure her husband? Or had they both fallen victim to the curse, doomed to roam the Pine Barrens as monsters? I was so engrossed in the journal that I almost didn't notice the change in the air. A new scent, sharp and wild, cut through the musty basement smell. My head snapped up, newfound instincts screaming danger. There, at the top of the stairs, stood a man. But even from this distance, I could tell he was no ordinary man. He was huge, easily over 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders and arms corded with muscle. But it was his eyes that truly terrified me. They glowed with the same amber light I had seen in the woods that fateful night. "So," he growled, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building, "you're the one who's been poking around our history, stirring up old ghosts." I stood slowly, my body tensing for fight or flight. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, though I feared I already knew the answer. The man, if he could be called that, smiled, revealing teeth that were just a bit too sharp to be human. "I think you know, William. I'm the one who marked you, the one who welcomed you to our pack." As he spoke, he began to descend the stairs, each step slow and deliberate. I could hear the wood creaking under his weight, see the way his muscles rippled beneath his clothes that seemed stretched to their limit, barely containing the beast within. "You don't understand what's happening to you," he continued, his voice a mix of threat and, was that pity? "You think you can cure it? Control it?" Elizabeth thought the same thing. Look where it got her. My mind raced. This man, this creature knew about Elizabeth. He was part of this, had been for a long time. "What happened to her?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you kill her?" He laughed, a harsh barking sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Kill her? Oh no, William. Elizabeth Blackwood is very much alive. She's one of us now, has been for nearly 80 years. The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow. Elizabeth, transformed into one of these creatures, living all these years in the depths of the Pine Barrens. Had her quest for a cure led her to this fate? Or had she embraced the change, given in to the primal power of the wolf? "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why me?" The man had reached the bottom of the stairs now, and he began to move towards me with a predator's grace. "It's not about you, William. It's about survival. Our kind. We're dying out. The modern world is encroaching on our territory, making it harder and harder to hide. We need new blood, strong blood." As he spoke, I could feel something stirring inside me. The beast, awakening in response to his presence. My muscles tensed, my senses sharpened even further. I could hear his heartbeat, smell the wild, musky scent of him. "You can feel it, can't you?" he said, now just a few feet away. "The power, the freedom. Why fight it? Embrace what you're becoming. Join us." For a moment, just a moment, I was tempted. I could feel the strength coursing through my veins, the primal call of the wild. But then I thought of the terror I'd experienced and the loss of control. I thought of Elizabeth, trapped in this half-life for decades. "No," I growled, surprised by the ferocity in my own voice. "I won't become a monster." The man's eyes narrowed, all pretense of friendliness vanishing. "You don't have a choice," he snarled. "The full moon is tomorrow night. You'll turn, whether you want to or not. And when you do, you'll hunt, you'll kill, you'll become what you were always meant to be." With that, he lunged at me, moving faster than any human possibly could. But my newfound reflexes kicked in, and I managed to dodge, sending him crashing into the table. Elizabeth's journal went flying, pages scattering across the floor. I didn't have time to think. Operating on pure instinct, I snatched up as many pages as I could and ran for the stairs. Behind me, I could hear the man, the werewolf, roaring in rage, the sound of splintering wood telling me he was right on my heels. I burst out of the basement and through the Historical Society's front door, not even registering the startled cry of the old woman at the reception desk. My car was just a few yards away, and I sprinted for it with everything I had. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps pounding on the pavement. As I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, I risked a glance back. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. The man was changing. Even in broad daylight, his body was twisting, expanding. Fur sprouted from his skin, his face elongating into a canine muzzle. The sight was so horrifying, so impossible, that for a moment I could only stare. That moment nearly cost me everything. A clawed hand, paw, swiped at me, raking across my back. Pain exploded through my body, and I cried out, nearly dropping my keys. But somehow I managed to get the car door open and throw myself inside. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands slick with what I realized was my own blood. The engine roared to life just as a massive form slammed into the side of the car, rocking it on its wheels. I threw the car into drive and slammed on the gas. The tires squealed as I peeled out of the parking lot, narrowly missing a startled pedestrian. In my rearview mirror, I could see the creature that had once been a man standing in the middle of the street, watching me go. Even from this distance, I could see the hunger in its eyes. I drove like a madman, taking random turns, half expecting to see a monstrous wolf creature loping after me at any moment. But gradually, as the adrenaline began to wear off, the pain from my back reasserted itself. I needed help, needed to tend to my wounds. But where could I go? A hospital was out of the question. How could I possibly explain claw marks that size? Almost without conscious thought, I found myself heading back to my cabin. It wasn't safe. Nowhere was safe now. But at least there I had first aid supplies and could try to make sense of the pages I'd managed to grab from Elizabeth's journal. As I pulled up to my cabin, the full weight of what had just happened hit me. I had been attacked in broad daylight by a creature that shouldn't exist. And tomorrow night, I might become one myself. With shaking hands, I gathered the scattered pages from Elizabeth's journal and made my way inside. I had less than 24 hours to find a way to stop this transformation, to save not just myself, but perhaps Elizabeth and all the others trapped by this curse. As I closed and locked the door behind me, I could swear I heard a distant howl. The hunt, it seemed, was far from over. The next few hours were a blur of frantic research and desperate attempts at self-treatment. I managed to clean and bandage the claw marks on my back as best I could, wincing at the depth of the wounds. They should have been much worse, should have torn me apart. But whether due to luck or my own changing physiology, they weren't as severe as I'd feared. With my injuries tended to, I turned my attention to the pages I'd managed to salvage from Elizabeth's journal. Spread out on my kitchen table, they painted a fragmented but tantalizing picture of her final days of research. Elizabeth had been convinced that the key to breaking the curse lay in a combination of botanical science and ancient ritual. The plant she called Lupin's Bane was central to her theory. Its properties seemed to both trigger and potentially reverse the lycanthropic transformation, depending on how it was prepared and used. But the ritual was complex, requiring specific conditions and ingredients. The plant had to be harvested under the full moon, its roots ground and mixed with other herbs in precise quantities. This mixture then had to be combined with the blood of a werewolf, willingly given, and consumed at the exact moment of moonrise on the night of the full moon. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on the half-mad scribblings of a woman who had disappeared decades ago. But it was the only hope I had. The problem was I didn't have all the ingredients. I had no idea where to find Lupin's bane, and even if I did, the full moon was tonight. There was no time to harvest it properly. And the blood of a werewolf? The only werewolves I knew of wanted to either kill me or force me to join their pack. As the day wore on, I could feel the changes in my body accelerating. My senses were in overdrive. I could hear the heartbeats of small animals in the woods around my cabin, smell things from miles away. My muscles ached, feeling as if they were trying to reshape themselves beneath my skin. Worse than the physical changes were the mental ones. Dark urges bubbled up from somewhere deep inside me. The desire to hunt, to chase, to feed. I found myself pacing my cabin like a caged animal, alternating between panic and a strange, feral excitement at the thought of what I might become when night fell. As the sun began to set, I knew I had to make a decision. I could stay here, lock myself in, and hope that I could somehow maintain control when the transformation hit. Or I could venture out into the Pine Barrens, try to find Elizabeth or the mysterious plant that might be my salvation. Both options seemed equally suicidal. If I stayed, I risked losing control and hurting someone. If I left, I was walking straight into the territory of the werewolf pack, weakened and vulnerable. In the end, the decision was made for me. As I stood at my window watching the sun sink below the horizon, I caught a flicker of movement in the woods. Then another, and another. They were out there surrounding my cabin, waiting. My heart pounding, I grabbed a backpack and hastily shoved in some supplies. Water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and the pages from Elizabeth's journal. As an afterthought, I grabbed a silver letter opener from my desk. I didn't know if the old legends about silver and werewolves were true, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. Just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, I slipped out the back door of my cabin and into the gathering darkness of the Pine Barrens. I could hear them moving through the woods, their footsteps far too quiet for creatures of their size. They were hurting me, I realized, driving me deeper into the forest. As I ran, ducking under branches and leaping over fallen logs, I could feel the change coming on stronger than ever. My vision sharpened, the night forest becoming as clear as day. My muscles bunched and stretched, my bones creaking as they reshaped themselves. I wanted to scream, but all that came out was a low, animalistic growl. I don't know how long I ran, or how deep into the barrens I went. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I fled, driven by terror and the inexorable pull of the rising moon. But eventually I burst into a small clearing and skidded to a stop. There in the center of the clearing stood a woman. She was old, impossibly old, her skin wrinkled and weathered like ancient parchment, but her eyes glowed with that same amber light I had come to fear. "Elizabeth," I gasped, somehow knowing without a doubt who she was. She smiled, revealing teeth that were just a bit too sharp. "Welcome, William," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "We've been waiting for you." As she spoke, shapes emerged from the forest around us. Men and women of all ages, all with those same glowing eyes. And behind them, larger shapes, fully transformed werewolves, their massive forms making my heart race with a mixture of fear and recognition. "Why?" I managed to ask, even as I felt my own body beginning to change more rapidly. "Why are you doing this?" Elizabeth's smile faded, replaced by a look of ancient sadness. "Because we have no choice," she said. "The curse, it's not just a transformation of the body, it's a transformation of the soul. We need to add new blood to our pack, or we'll lose ourselves entirely to the beast." As she spoke, I could feel my transformation accelerating. Fur sprouted from my skin, my face elongating into a muzzle. The pain was excruciating, but beneath it was a wild exhilaration, a sense of power unlike anything I'd ever experienced. "You can't fight it," Elizabeth continued. "Believe me, I tried. For years, I searched for a cure, but in the end, I realized this isn't a curse. It's a gift, a chance to be more than human, to be truly free. Part of me wanted to believe her, the wolf part, now growing stronger by the second. But another part, the part that was still William, still human, rebelled against the idea. With the last of my human strength, I reached into my backpack and pulled out the pages from Elizabeth's journal. "Your research," I growled, my voice barely recognizable. "You found a way to stop this, to cure it." Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with a mixture of anger and, was that fear? "Those notes were incomplete," she said, her voice sharp. "The cure, it was a fool's errand. It doesn't work." But even as she spoke, I could see the doubt in her eyes, the longing. Despite her words, some part of her, the human part, still wanted to believe. "We can try," I managed to say, fighting against the transformation with every ounce of willpower I had left. "Please, Elizabeth, help me. Help all of us." For a moment, the clearing was silent, save for the sound of my labored breathing and the low growls of the werewolves surrounding us. Then slowly Elizabeth nodded. "The lupine's bane," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It grows in a cave at the heart of the Barrens. But the ritual, it requires the blood of a werewolf, willingly given under the full moon." I understood then what I had to do. With trembling hands that were rapidly becoming paws, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver letter opener. The metal burned against my skin, but I gritted my teeth against the pain. "Take it," I said, holding the blade out to Elizabeth. "My blood, willingly given." Elizabeth hesitated for just a moment, then took the letter opener. With a swift motion, she sliced my palm, collecting the blood in a small vial she produced from her pocket. As soon as the blood touched the air, I felt a jolt of energy course through me. The transformation, which had been progressing rapidly, seemed to slow. "Quickly," Elizabeth said, her voice urgent. "We don't have much time." What followed was a desperate race against the moon and my own changing body. Elizabeth led me deeper into the Barrens, to a hidden cave illuminated by phosphorescent fungi. There, growing in the eerie blue-green light, was a small patch of silvery plants with deep purple flowers. The lupine's bane. As Elizabeth worked to prepare the cure, grinding the roots and mixing them with other herbs she produced from hidden caches around the cave, I fought against the transformation with everything I had. The other werewolves watched from the shadows, their glowing eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Just as I felt I could hold on no longer, that the wolf was about to take over completely, Elizabeth approached me with a small cup filled with a dark, swirling liquid. "Drink," she commanded, "quickly, before the moon reaches its zenith." I took the cup with hands that were more paw than human and drank deeply. The liquid burned like fire going down, spreading through my body in waves of searing heat and bone-deep cold. I fell to my knees, my body convulsing as the potion warred with the curse flowing through my veins. For what felt like an eternity, I was caught between two worlds, man and beast, human and wolf. I could feel my body trying to reshape itself, bones cracking and reforming, fur sprouting and then receding. The pain was beyond anything I had ever experienced, and I heard myself howling, a sound that was neither fully human nor fully wolf. And then suddenly, it was over. I found myself lying on the cold stone floor of the cave, drenched in sweat but fully, blessedly human. Around me, I could hear gasps and murmurs of astonishment. Slowly, I raised my head. The cave was filled with people, normal, human people. The werewolves were gone, replaced by men and women of all ages, looking at their hands and bodies in wonder and disbelief. Elizabeth knelt beside me, tears streaming down her face. She looked younger somehow. The weight of decades of curse lifted from her shoulders. "It worked," she whispered. "After all these years, it actually worked." As the reality of what had happened sank in, the cave erupted in a mixture of laughter, cries, and exclamations of joy. People who had been trapped in the form of beasts for years, decades, even centuries, were human again. Families torn apart by the curse were reunited. The nightmare that had plagued the Pine Barrens for generations was finally over. In the days that followed, we worked to help the former werewolves reintegrate into society. It wasn't easy. Many had been living as creatures of the night for so long that they struggled to adapt to the modern world. But slowly, with patience and support, they began to reclaim their humanity. As for me, I stayed in the Pine Barrens, working alongside Elizabeth to document everything we had learned about the curse and its cure. We shared our findings with cryptozoologists and folklorists around the world, shedding light on centuries of myth and legend. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is full, I find myself looking out into the dark forests of the Pine Barrens, remembering the terror and exhilaration of those few days when I stood on the precipice between man and beast. Part of me, a small, primal part, misses the raw power and freedom of the wolf. But then I think of the cost, of the lives ruined and the humanity lost, and I know we made the right choice. The Pine Barrens are quieter now, the nights no longer filled with inhuman howls. But if you venture deep enough into the forest, to a certain hidden cave illuminated by glowing fungi, you might just find a small patch of silver-leaf plants with deep purple flowers. A reminder that even the darkest curses can be broken, and that humanity, with all its flaws and weaknesses, is a gift worth fighting for.